Welcome, online viewers, to our Whole Life Church Let's Talk About Racism video check-in. My name is Linda, and I'm glad that you're here. 5.5 months ago, after we all witnessed the horrific, unjustifiable killing of George Floyd by a police officer, Whole Life Church senior pastor Andy went on to commit to having some difficult conversations about racism and to take some steps towards making change. Atara Smith took Andy at his word, went to Crisia Capellas Evans to ask if we could start some Let's Talk About Racism conversations in our church community. Crisia, who is the director of the Justice Ministries, gave full support, and in August, Atara spearheaded our monthly efforts on focusing on dismantling racism. In August, we had our first panel discussion. In September, we had part 2 of our panel discussion. In October, Rachel, who is here with us today, started to organize and to lead out in a small group that meets right now on a weekly basis to read a book together and to have a safe space to explore how did we get here and to look at how to move forward in a different way. Now we're in November, and so today 5 of us, Tammy, Craig, Brad, Rachel, and myself, are here together at the Kitchen House to sort of do a check-in on one another to see how our personal journeys have been going since we have started this collective focus on dismantling racism. So join us as we have a conversation which I imagine will be somewhat vulnerable, but honest as we share our own personal journeys. Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. Again, I'm Linda, and I am a health professional. I am a mother of 2 wonderful teenage boys. I am a musician, and I am a seeker of truth and freedom.
Hi, I'm Rachel Lowry Meharry, and I am here as a wife and mother, 2 small children, blonde, blue-eyed children. And I work at Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE as it's known. I'm really humbled to be part of this group. I grew up in this church, and it's nice to be back.
I'm Tammy Cinquemani. I'm the pastor of worship and liturgy at the Whole Life Church, and I am the mother of 2, grandmother of 2, and just really humbled and honored to be on this journey.
Hi, my name is Craig Moore. I am a health professional myself as well. I work for one of our healthcare institutions here in the Central Florida area, more on the business side of things. I'm a husband, no children, childless by choice. But a godfather, uncle, big brother to many people that I know in the community. Happy to be part of this conversation and grateful that our church is allowing us to really carve out some time to have this conversation.
I'm Brad Jones. I'm a longtime church member. I'm a retired firefighter with the city of Orlando for 25 years, but now I'm currently a garden educator at the Edible Education Experience where we are today. And I'm really happy to be involved with a group of curious people who are interested in making the world a better place.
So I think I'm starting off our conversation together today. And the place that we wanted to start is with what brings each of us into this conversation in this moment. Where do we find ourselves? How did we find ourselves here? And I volunteered to go first, but then we'll go around. So what brings me to a conversation about anti-racism? So in the summer of 2016, we had just gone through, it was July of 2016, we had just gone through a really incredibly challenging week as a nation. It was before the 2016 election. Philando Castile and Alton Sterling had been shot on camera. And the Dallas police shooting happened at a protest rally. And I, as a white person who had always grown up in multicultural environments, I thought that I could probably figure out what needed to change here. I could fix it. So I was in Boston area. I looked at, I Googled Black Lives Matter Boston because I didn't know what else to Google. I was just searching for a place to express how wrong this was and that I, as a white person, didn't agree with this. And I saw that there was a grief space planned that very evening for people in the Boston area by Black Lives Matter. And I was packing up my bags to go, and I was reading through the event details, and it was like, white people, please don't come. And I was like, what? What do you mean? White people don't come. Like, I want to show that I'm not that kind of white person. Like, I want to be there and help solve this problem. And so I nearly closed my computer in a huff. I nearly didn't and I nearly did go anyway, even though they had said not to come. But instead I paused and I kept reading, and it said on the rest of the invite that there was actually a white affinity grief space planned by this group called Showing Up for Racial Justice, which I had never heard of. And I said, fine, I'll go there then, because I didn't have very many friends in the Boston area. I needed to talk about this, and so fine. So I showed up in my white liberal certainty, and and they had 4 different rooms set up in this tiny little community center, and it was already packed with people when I arrived. And one of the rooms was for like painting signs for protests. I was like, no. One of the rooms was about learning, and I was like, no. And one of the rooms was about action. I was like, yes. And so I ran right into that room and shouldered my way in and started to listen to what was going on around me in that room already. And they were talking about, they were like, let's just go around and see where everybody is on a scale of 1 to 10 when it comes to action. 1 is you wear your Black Lives Matter pin, and they're all like, and I'm like, And then 10 was you're putting your body on the line every day. You're willing to put your body on the line in violent protest situations for Black and brown folk. And I was like, okay, so I'm not even a 1 on this scale, so I'm just gonna slide out of this room. Excuse me, pardon me. And I slunk out with my heart a little more open, a little more humble, a little more in realization that there was certainly something I was missing. And I slunk out and went to the room that was for learning. And they had already started as well, but they just welcomed me in with open arms. There were 2 people from Surge Boston there that I don't know their names, but I will never forget how welcoming they were, how kind, how eager to just hear where I was and how I'd gotten there. And they weren't shaming. They weren't, why have you just now woken up to this? It was very much a, wherever you are, thank you for being here, we need you. And that was the moment that I started to listen. And I didn't know I hadn't been listening. So that was an incredibly powerful moment. On the train on the way home that night, I started to purchase some of the things that they had recommended as far as books to read. And the very first book I purchased was Waking Up White by Debbie Irving, who is a local to the Boston area. I didn't know there were white anti-racists until that day. And that was the day that I decided that's what I wanted to be and do. And so from that moment, I've been reading and trying to act without knowing everything and trying to move in a different direction. In no way perfectly, and that's actually good news. We don't have to do this perfectly. And nobody's expecting us to do this perfectly. So that's kind of the way that I came to begin this lifelong journey, lifelong. It will be lifelong, because until this moment, it has been lifelong indoctrinating, and it is going to take a lifelong effort to undo that learning. So that's, for me, where things began. And I'm so glad to be with all of you. Where did it start for you? Who would like to continue?
Well, yeah, sure. So I think for me, My parents are West Indian by background, so my experience has not been the traditional African American experience. I grew up in the West Indies. I was born here in the United States. I'm an American citizen, but my family was from Jamaica, and so I'm a first generation American. And growing up in that household, things were a little different. I lived in Jamaica half of my formative years, half of the time I was there, half of the time I was in the States. And when you're in a culture like Jamaica and everyone looks like you, there's definitely a caste system, but there's not necessarily racism like we experience here in the States. And so I would say, while there are a lot of African Americans who've been exposed very early on, my exposure came much later. I told the story the other day of even when I first moved to Florida. When my grandfather relocated here, I came to live with him, and moved to Central Florida, went to this elementary school nearby, and for the first time in my life, after growing up in New York, for the first time in my life, I could run outside and play and ride my bike, and made some friends with kids on my street. And one of them was a little white kid down the street, and we were best of friends. We rode our bikes together, swam together, drew monster trucks together. And he always wore a rebel cap. And I just wanted to be like him. So I went to Albertsons back in the 80s and bought myself a rebel cap so we could be, brothers. And I went to school, and my African-American, I think 5th grade teacher kind of snatched me up and pulled me aside and was like, "What are you doing?" And obviously she didn't understand my background. And I just said, "Well, my friend wears one, I wear," she's like, "Do you know what this means?" And I had no clue. That was something that was necessarily taught to me in grade school in New York or in Jamaica. So that was my first exposure to, there is a different system here that you're not aware of. And I would say after that, as you grow up in society, as polite society as it may be, you tend to learn and see, and there are all kinds of experiences I could talk about through my lifetime. I think what's brought me here to this conversation today, I think the impetus of it was maybe a couple years ago, we were at a church retreat, and we had one of those interactive things where I can't remember the name of the Walk of Privilege. So we had the Walk of Privilege where we all lined up, of all different cultures and classes lined up, and then take a step forward if you've experienced this, take a step back if you've not experienced this, and so forth. And so we did that Walk of Privilege, and at the end, the privileged folks obviously are at the front, and the non-privileged are in the back. And sure enough, I and maybe a handful of other people out of 20 or 30 were at the very back. And then we all went into the auditorium and had a conversation about it. And so as we're having the conversation, a lot of younger African American folks that were part of that group were talking about what they were experiencing. And I was silent. And my wife kept nudging me and saying, "Why don't you say something? Why don't you say something?" So I finally did start to voice what I felt. And for me, it was the realization that for so long, I've been wearing this mask. I've tried to fit into the culture and fit into the society so seamlessly that I don't even think about it anymore. And when we had that conversation, someone came up to me afterwards and said something to me, and I just broke down. I just broke down and started sobbing and kind of stepped off to the side. And it was then, and it was in the midst of all of these, shootings and killings of unarmed Black and brown people, that really kind of just made me stop and reflect in a way I've never wanted to reflect before. And then George Floyd. And I think, reading about those others who have experienced those tragedies, and then actually seeing a Black man being murdered that way, there was something inside of me that just broke loose. And as I've shared with the folks here, that I felt a rage in me that I've never experienced before. And I'm trying to cope with that rage. I cannot say that I've come to peace with that rage yet. And if anyone knows me, I am the quiet, most docile. I always joke and say, this is Craig happy, this is Craig sad, this is Craig angry. I am the most even-keeled person. But I know that inherent to my personality, I hold a lot in. And this that I'm holding in, there are just some days I just don't know what to do with it. I pull into the parking lot at work, and I literally have to flip a switch in my brain so that I can just go about my day. And I stopped reading the news during work because once I did that, it just took me off, track. And then at the end of the day, when I get in my car, I flip the switch back. So I'm glad to be here and have this conversation, but the reality is I don't think I'm alone. I think there are a lot of folks that are like me that are just trying to figure out what to do with this. And then how do we heal as a society and move past this? So that's my story.
Well, I'm one of those folks who's like you, Craig. So, growing up, well, actually, for me, I didn't start my life in the U.S. My parents also are from the Caribbean. And my family moved to Puerto Rico when I was 3. And my parents had us go to an American school there. So Puerto Rico, it's American territory. And so this was my first exposure. I was in preschool. They called it nursery school at the time, but there. And this was my first exposure to white America and racism. And so it was from, a toddler that I recognized that there was something about me that made me the odd one out, that made me undesirable, that made me unattractive, that made me have a lesser value than the whites at the American school that I went to. And then we moved to Ohio some years later after our time in Puerto Rico. And Ohio is Ohio. So it certainly is not culturally diverse. It's the Midwest. It was very Black American and white American, and that's it. And so my experience there just continued to solidify my initial experience in Puerto Rico, that as a Black person, you're not valuable, you're not significant. And even though I had a lot of white friends, this was a message that I got in multiple ways as I grew up and spent a number of years in Ohio. By the time I reached high school, and because I'm a social person, I've always had my group of girlfriends and my friends that hung out with me, and we got along great. And so they started to get an education. I guess my active step in having these conversations started in Ohio with my good friends who were very close to me. By the time I'm in high school, there are more Black kids that I have access to because I was the only one in my class. And so I had good relationships and friendships with those kids. And so I was kind of the bridge between my white friends and my Black friends in high school. And then they started to form friendships. And the white kids kind of started to realize that, they're kind of like okay or cool or attractive or fun or desirable or whatever. And, we would have lots of joking conversations as in ways that I guess teenagers would about race. And I guess that's when my recognition of how it wasn't like an analytical decision that I made, but just being in the setting that I was in, I think that's when I kind of realized and naturally stepped into the role of starting to have some conversations in a teenage way at that time. And as the years have gone on, I think I went through a season of deciding I don't really want to deal with white Americans anymore because what comes from them is very hurtful. And the friendship that they offer is very conditional. We accept you up until a point, but it's not unconditional. You start letting your friends, our kids started dating, ours being the white parents. My friends started dating Black guys because now I was the bridge, and that was a problem and that was a barrier. And there was drama that came about for them and so on because of that. And, the things that were and are hurtful that come from some white Americans continue to show themselves. And so I did reach a point in my life where I disconnected myself from white Americans, and my world was all Black. And, certainly was more comfortable in many ways because of that. And I've gotten to the point now where it just seems like things have shifted in different directions, and I have a much more multicultural group of friends and people in my inner world again. And so now I find myself in a position where, certainly again, after the killing of George Floyd, all of us have been shaken by that. At least all of us here, and many people have been shaken by that in a way that stands out, from the other atrocities that have happened to Black people that we know about. And so as requests have come my way to play a role in being a voice about this, I have turned none of those down, and I recognize our conversations like this and my many hours spent in looking into understanding the history of racism in this country and how that has impacted white people and how that has impacted Black people and how that has impacted our relationships to each other and so on. There are a lot of hours that I've put into this topic since I've been asked to participate. I didn't volunteer, and I probably wouldn't have, but it's a responsibility that I have because it's important, and the division and the damage is very real. So here I am.
I want to say that after hearing the two of you speak, I'm reminded again about how that was not my experience in childhood. And I think that's something that, like Rachel, I'm going to be needing to be reminded of that for the rest of my life, because it's so easy to slip back into forgetting that. I grew up in an all-white family, around an all-white dinner table. And our table was one of lots of lively conflict and excitement and engaging in debate. We were a very word-oriented family. And I grew up always being encouraged that the world would expect me to voice my opinion, and the world would anticipate me to have an opinion and to be outwardly expressive of that. Even though not everybody accepted my opinion, obviously, I was taught that was my role in the world, was to be confident and to step forward and to raise my hand and to engage. And so I'm a person who is fascinated by conflict. I like to think that I'm more fascinated by the process of resolution. There might be some people who think that I'm just fascinated with conflict alone. But so I've always been drawn to the conflict that as I became an adult and started recognizing that other people had different experiences than I did, I was interested in pulling that thread. And when I became a firefighter with the City of Orlando, as a government agency, I think government agencies, in my understanding, tend to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of creating a diverse work environment. I think in some ways they're ahead of the private sector. And so I was, for the first time in my life, I was sitting at dinner tables with people that didn't look like me and had different experiences than me. And the fire department is a different kind of job where you're not just sharing a cubicle, you're sharing a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen table, a TV. So you're living with people. And so I was really, it was a revelation to me that I had not seen this whole facet of life. So I've been in lots of conversations individually or in small groups about race, and I've always found them to be heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. But when our church decided we were going to, as a church, as a congregation, put this on the table and address it, I'm intrigued and I'm drawn to that, and I'm really curious, and I have apprehensions. I think this is, in some ways, it's who we should be as a church. In some ways, I think it's new territory for us to address as a church. So I'm honestly really curious, like, how do we do this at this scale? Because I feel like my experience has only been at this kind of scale. So I'm really excited about where this can go. I don't have any preconceived resolutions, but I'm really interested in the conflict.
Well, I am a child of the 60s. I grew up in Chicago, so I should have had a front row seat to the civil rights movement at the time. I did not. I was in a pocket of a white community in Chicago, so somewhat protected. I'm embarrassed to say that I went through my entire educational career up through my master's degree without ever going to school, never being in a classroom with a black or brown person. Yeah, it's not, I don't deserve a badge for that or anything. It's pretty sad. Yeah, and so, but interestingly, it was very clear in my family that we weren't racist. You know, we were not racist at all. You know, we accepted everyone. There'd be the occasional joke, you know, here and there, but we weren't racist, you know. And so fast forward to our move here to Florida, you know, my life changed without a doubt. And one of the beautiful, wonderful changes was developing friendships with people of color. And it enriched my life. But again, of course I would, because I wasn't racist. You know, there would be no reason why I wouldn't. Well, when this whole thing, again, it seems like a thread that keeps happening with COVID and then the George Floyd situation, I, of course, got my white savior hat on and said, we need to do something about this. And so I was chatting with a good friend of mine who is another white woman, amazing friend. And I said, we need to start a conversation at our church. I'm a leader at the church. I can, you know, make this happen. Let's do this. And she very gently and very graciously said, Tammy, you're not qualified to do that. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? I understand completely what you're saying, Rachel. What do you mean I'm not racist? I'm a leader in the church. You know, this would be, and she said, Tammy, you don't know enough yet. You have to learn before you can speak. And I so appreciate her speaking truth into my life, and I respected that. And I said, okay, if this is what she thinks I should do, and I really respect, because she has had a journey on this topic for years, and I knew that. So I decided I'm gonna educate myself. This is not something that I should start. This is when Atara stepped in, you know, to start this. And so instead of being the front row, instead of taking that lead as the person, as the, you know, that's going to lead this, I decided to read some books to get educated. And what I read, you know, it's knowledge. Once you know, you can't unknow. Once you've seen, you can't unsee. And I realized that I grew up in a place that does not truly qualify me to speak into this until I have taken time to take that back seat and to let those people who know and truly understand what has gone on, you know, are able to do that. Can I be an anti-racist? I believe I can, but even to this day, I feel the passion for it, but there's still so much I need to learn and how to go about doing that without hurting people in my process. Because I'm realizing that I tend to be passionate and I can just storm through things without truly understanding how little I know. And so for me, this conversation is so important to me because I do want to help in this fight. I do want to dismantle the system that has so wronged so many people. But in order to do that, I need to take the right steps first. And part of that is having these very difficult conversations and making the mistakes and doing the wrong things, but having friends who are willing to be honest with me. And this is what I appreciate about this group. So that's what brought me here.
I just want to say, I so appreciate you starting that way, Rachel, just because I think we all make assumptions, right? We all make assumptions about where people come from. And I will say that one of my righteous indignations about this, where we are today sometimes, is why did it take white America so long to realize that all of these things were happening? And part of my anger was just that I felt like people knew it was happening but didn't care. But when I start talking to people and understanding their personal experiences, you've gone to school for how many years and you've never interacted with anyone of color, it makes sense. And so I think, you know, in having these conversations, a good place to always start is kind of what's your story? Because now I can understand that, and I'm less angry at people for not realizing, that all of this exists, because now I understand where you're coming from. And I would also say too, it's an educational journey for African Americans and people of color. For me, again, my background being slightly different, I didn't realize how much racial disparity there was in the justice system until I started educating myself. I experienced some of it. I've experienced some of those things, but until I read books like The New Jim Crow, I didn't realize how far back that goes. So it's like I'm educating myself too to really understand the socioeconomic and the legal things that have caused institutional racism. So I'm on that journey too. It's not just because I'm Black that I know all that. I don't know all of these things myself. So I feel like now I have a lot more grace because I'm in a learning process, but I also understand that other people are not learning process as well.
One of the things that it's interesting you talk about that the inspiration to pursue an education and to pursue empathy and to try and understand a situation. I think for me personally, I think my gut reaction is to enter life, as though I'm the norm, and I was taught that I was the norm. And then when you bump into something that's different, then let's study that. Let's have empathy for that experience. Let's really focus on what does it mean to be Craig? What does it mean to be Black? And so I started to pursue that kind of empathy and trying to imagine what would it be like if I weren't me. And I think, not that that's not helpful, but I remember hearing an interview with Toni Morrison once, and I didn't know who she was, but I saw that she was and she even has confessed that she has kind of a superiority complex. She really thinks she's right, and she exudes that in a way that honestly comes off unsettling to white men because we're not used to that. So in my first exposure to this woman who was very confidently engaged in this interview, somebody was talking to her about what is it like to be Black in the world today. And she, just without any kind of apology, said, "You're asking the wrong question." And he was kind of like, "Well, I thought this would be great." And she's like, "No, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, what does it mean to be white? You haven't really explored what it means for you to be white." And I'm embarrassed to say this, but my first reaction was like, that's ridiculous. Like, what a dumb thing for somebody to say. Obviously, I know me, and truly, whiteness is not a thing. Whiteness is this social construct. There's no objective thing that makes me white. It's all made up. And it literally took me months, if not years, to start really hearing that statement without a strong, strident response, and to really consider, what does it mean for me to be white in this world? And that is, talk about a thread that you start pulling, that's a giant can of worms that the more honest I approached that question, the more uncomfortable it made me. And it is one of those things, though, that once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't unhear it. And it's not something that is, that I've opened up and then cleaned up. I've opened up and it's a bigger mess, and it's a bigger mess, and it's a bigger mess. And I appreciate it, and I can't understand what it's like to tap into a rage that's within you that you don't know how to respond to. I don't have that. I've opened up something within me, though, that is a mess, and I don't know how to resolve that. And so
I have a question, Brad.
yeah.
So you were saying that you heard her words one way, and
Yep.
it took years for you to start to hear it a little differently. Are you willing to share how you hear it now, or how that changed in your understanding?
I think it means something to be white. Honestly, I think it's a gift that I've been given. I think it's it's an awful thing, but it's it's a privilege. I had someone very close to me ask me, is it a privilege that I have to apologize for or to confess? And I don't think so. I think I can't justify why I've been given something. I can only think about, what do I do with this? Now what will I do with it? So as uncomfortable as it is to say I have a license in life that you do not have, I have that license. I can either deny that I have that or attempt to do something with it that's productive. And I think that's the same with any privilege, whether it's earned or bestowed. I think I love to think that I've earned some privileges in my life that I still believe I should have good stewardship with. But if something has been stolen and given to me, what do I do with that? And I have to acknowledge that it's stolen goods. And I don't know how to just give it back to the person that it was stolen from. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how to approach that. That's a long and expensive journey in my mind to bring equality, because that will cost me. And my survival instinct is to quickly move away from that, something that's going to cost me. The same way that if I found out I was driving a car that had been stolen and given to me, what do I do with that? I don't know who it was stolen from. So I don't know if
like
that's...
the car.
And I love this car.
Right.
Right. The idea that I go into a world without the kind of apprehensions or fears, or the questioning of values, or the idea of like I have to fit in somehow because I'm unaccepted culturally, or I'm unaccepted physically.
Just the disenfranchisement, I think. I think about growing up as a kid and all the television programs I watched. I mean, if I was a person of color, I would have seen nobody that looks like me in any of the programs I watched. And I would have never considered that was something that, and I wonder, Brad, what you're saying is about what it's going to cost you. And I agree. I mean, I think, but I guess my question is though, the cost is for equality. The cost is not for someone to be, I don't think people are looking to be above, white people, but just to be on a level playing field. So that to me, at least, and particularly as a Christ follower, that should be the very least that I'm willing to sacrifice for. And I understand it's a scary prospect because we are so used to the privilege that we have without even thinking about it. But I don't understand why we wouldn't be willing to make that, or at least attempt to make that sacrifice. Learning how to do that in incremental ways so that we can eventually see a system that's more equal.
Yeah. I'll jump in to say, like, oppression is what it feels like when you've actually been at the front of the line, and now you're trying to, like, equality actually feels like oppression to us if we, I'm borrowing that from somebody and butchering it a little bit, but the cost. Let's also talk about the joy that is the reward of actually going through this. Like, I keep referencing Pastor Andy's tunnel of chaos in these conversations, like the reward of going through that and of actually dismantling white supremacy, which is the thing that gives us the privilege at all, right? Like, if we can dismantle the thing that actually gives us these privileges, which are, to have a privilege, you have to have people who are underprivileged, right? It's the flip side of racism is the privilege. To begin to come to a place where we don't see it as a gift, but as and I think that's what you're saying, like that it's a terrible gift, like a terrible thing to be benefiting from.
Yes, but it's so strange for us to be thinking of as opportunities as terrible. And this is one thing that, in terms of finding the statement meaningful in my life, I think I'm trying to more and more examine my life and think about, and this is just a humbling experience across the board, that I want to think that I'm responsible for every success in my life, and any failure in my life has been kind of a systemic problem that I succumb to. So I'm independently successful and I'm dependently failure. So the idea of when I have opportunities and I think, would this door have opened for me if I were a woman? Would this door have opened for me if I were black? I think I'm going to think really critically about that. I've tried to stop the show every now and then, think, okay, if I weren't white, would this be happening to me? And that can be like everything from, I'm going to go for a jog at 9:30 p.m. and I don't care where I am. I'm going to knock on somebody's door and I don't care that I haven't shaved. It won't matter. They'll listen to me anyway. I'm going to be in a car and not be questioned about, is it my car? You know, those kinds of things. So I'm trying to look at those. And then I also want to look at the way we talk about we. And especially I think as we approach this in our church, I think it's so hard, and I don't want to speak for white people in general, it's so hard for me not to consider that I am the norm. And that when I catch myself saying things like, we Christians need to be better at this. And I think, well, there's been a lot of Christians who've been really good at this for a long time. I just mean white Christians need to be better at this. And this is where I'm almost nervous about this being outside the wheelhouse of our typical church function, because we are so focused on being equal at the foot of the cross, and we preach that grace is everybody's a worm, and yet everybody is worthy of the grace of God, and we're all in this together. But for us to look at our congregation and say, there's an expectation of me that's going to be different than an expectation of you in terms of solution or resolve. That there's things that I need to do because I have this gift of privilege. There's ways that I have to use it and it's hard for me to even speak this, but is it inappropriate for someone to say, come on, you do the same. My job is your job is your job. Here's everybody's job. It's all the same. Go do that. Let's make racism go away.
It's a white problem.
It's right. So even though I love that you say that you may not have felt qualified, or maybe you weren't qualified in a moment to say, I can help solve this problem. But there's things that I feel like you and we have to step up and figure this out so that we can solve things that other people can't.
And I agree with that. And I think my question, I would really like to ask Craig and Linda this. I think in our process, we're going to make mistakes.
Well, I may have just made one. I'm curious.
That's all the time. So I know. I'm like, oh my word. Yeah.
As those words are coming out of my mouth, I haven't asked a black person, how does that sound when a white guy says that?
Well, here we go.
Yeah, I was going to say. So I'm kind of. So what is that? Is that helpful? Even though it's attempting, but we're messing up. I mean, how do you?
I actually was going to say something, so I'm glad you brought this question around. I really, it's very interesting because Brad, you said after Craig and I kind of shared a little bit about what brings us to this conversation, or when did we realize that we needed to have a conversation. You commented on how it was interesting to hear about experiences that you are not familiar with and that you haven't gone through yourself. It's the same thing. So as I listen to you white Americans talk about growing and understanding that there's a problem and wanting to learn how to right this problem, that's the perspective I'm not familiar with, and so it's interesting to hear, back to Craig's point, and learn about each person's story. To me, there is only value in that if people are willing to be, honest and transparent. So my response to you and Rachel and Tammy is, for me, you haven't said anything that has put me off, because whether or not you put voice to what is true, it's still true. And it impacts people in the way that it impacts them, whether or not you put voice to it. And so I can only appreciate the courage to come forward and say, okay, it's a little messy. I got some toilet paper stuck on the bottom of my shoe, and my shirt's untucked in the back, but I'm gonna take a step. It's better than saying nothing and doing nothing and feeling more comfortable because you're not making any mistakes. And so I appreciate the experience of hearing about, what this is like for you three at the stage. I respect it. And I think that there's way more good than harm that's going to come from continuing to be willing to do it imperfectly, but to explore from sincere hearts. How do we really act more like Christ? I mean, at the end of the day. Yeah. I don't know, Craig, what is your
No, I agree
feeling?
with you. I think a lot of that's born out of relationships, right? So I've struggled with, well, first I will say I have a deep-seated realization now of what it really meant to live through that civil rights struggle. Because I'm sitting now in healthcare, but corporate America, and I struggle, let's be honest, I struggle with what I should say or shouldn't say, because I know that could impact me financially, that could impact my work, it could impact how I relate to the community. There's a lot of vulnerability for me to, when I even talk about the rage that's inside of me, as I said it, I'm like, man, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I'm not going to act out on that rage, but I'm being honest.
I'm so glad
right?
you used that word rage, because old white guy is not used to hearing a guy like you be honest about rage. Mm-hmm. And I think I don't want to hear you say that. Because to me, if I can reserve rage for somebody who has all other kinds of dysfunction in their life, then I can say, well, that's where that comes from. It comes from their own personal dysfunction. When I see and this is the thing that I don't want to have a lot of shame about being white, because I think that's not productive. But the part that is a struggle for me is just that, the idea of not trying to not hearing rage until it comes from someone who has worked so hard to conform to a standard that is set by people who look like me. The standard that this is awful to say out loud, but the standard that you work so hard to maintain is not a self-imposed standard. It's not even a people who you consider to be your own setting that standard. Mm-hmm. It's an imposed standard that you've had to accept that comes from people who look like me. And I don't want to hear about rage or about frustration or about exhaustion or about hurt until it comes from someone who looks like that.
Yeah.
And that I'll take personally, because that's true personally.
I appreciate that, and I think being in a setting where you can be vulnerable helps to forward that conversation. So, saying this, in this intimate environment, feels safe. But again, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, there's a vulnerability for people who've worked so hard to establish themselves, because so much of the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, has been so demonized. And it's been taken so off context from where it all started and what it truly means. And so living in corporate America, you're worried about saying anything or speaking up, because I got to put food on the table, a roof over our heads, and clothes on our backs. And so the opportunity I see now is when I have friends like you who are willing to engage in the struggle, I would say, yeah, absolutely take full advantage of that privilege. Because sometimes I feel like those words coming from me already have a taint to them by certain people in white America. But if they're coming from someone that looks like them that can be that bridge, it can have such a greater impact. And I don't care if it's messy, honestly. I'm one of the few people that have said, or I shouldn't say that. I have said for myself, ask the dumbest question you want to ask. Anything that's on your mind, I'm open. This is the time to have that conversation. So don't leave anything on the table. I'm willing to have that conversation with you. And I'm willing to walk that journey with you, even if it's messy. So let's get it all on the table. Let's learn from each other, and then let's move forward together. And I'm going to lean on that privilege you have, because you have it. I can't take that away from you. You shouldn't be ashamed. It's yours. But how do we leverage that together?
Relationships are so huge. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, I think, is just being open to having a relationship.
The one caveat I would make, though, is because I know there are a lot of, Linda and I have had this conversation. There are a lot of folks that are open to having the conversations, but at the end of the conversation, you also have a responsibility. So I can't be the sounding board for every question or thought you have, or I'm learning and you need to learn too. So let's have the conversation, but then let's both walk away with, what are we going to learn together? At some point, for some people, it does become fatiguing if I'm the only Black person you come to and you ask these questions, or the only sounding board you have. Expand your scope, get to know other people, but also educate yourself. I'm educating myself, you educate yourself. And then from that education, and let's be clear about what's truth. Let's come to the table understanding that these things are true. They're not made up, they're not fictional. So let's move forward together in truth to resolve this.
I think it's something that Edwina had said at one of the things when she was talking to a coworker who was white, and how this coworker came to her kind of verklempt about the situation and expected her to make this white person feel better. And I think that's horrible. And I know I've done that in the past.
Think how often that's been portrayed. I mean,
Yeah.
when Black people show up on the screen, there's a lot of time that's their job.
Yeah.
It's to resolve the moral conflict within a white person. I mean, that's such a trope that we step into our own personal lives and think, okay, where's my Bagger Vance to help me through this kind of situation?
Yeah.
And that's I think a lot of the education, though, is when you take when we put out there, everybody, let's really resolve to educate ourselves. I think a lot of it is introspection, that you can't go to another person for that. You really have to look inside. And
Put on your big boy pants and
yes, I think there's and that's something that honestly we've talked a little bit, even in these statements that we read before, about how we're going to what are we going to come together on at this table. Some of these are really relevant when we leave here. What are we going to function in this way also?
I wanted to share one thing that probably sounds a little less rosy and optimistic. Part of what I experience and part of my perspective as I am on this journey and involved in the way that I am, one of the things that I believe is that there is going to be a season of more white Americans being aware and engaged and interested in learning and making change, more than what we've experienced prior to this in my lifetime. But I think that there's a lot of overwhelm and discomfort that's linked to this experience for white Americans born and living in this era to say, oh my gosh, we've inherited this, it's a mess. We've been pretty comfortable in our ignorance up until now, but now that we have learned a little bit more, it's a never-ending burden of trying to right a wrong that you were born into. And I think that the draining and overwhelming nature of that will eventually wear out a good number of initially well-meaning white people. And it's exhausting, because it's exhausting to be Black. We don't get the opportunity to say, you know what, I'm tired of. Yeah, I'm going to stop for a week or a month take a break, just, coast along without always having to be aware or being on my guard or having to work 3 times as hard or whatever. There are so many things that come with it. And so we just live with what we don't have the opportunity to take off. But for those who have the opportunity to say, oh my goodness, I'm exhausted, I'm shutting my mind down and just taking a break from this, it's much more comfortable to be comfortable. Mm-hmm. So part of my not so optimistic but honest viewpoint is that white people are going to get weary of the burden of making change. And we're going to continue to struggle in ways and make progress at a slower rate than we potentially could.
That's one of the damages that racism has done to white folk, is that we do not have this resilience of being, we are very fragile. And we have to push through that. And what I have heard I hear and honor your non-rosy view of that. And I want to stand in that gap and say, I am only one, but I am one. And I know from this small group that we're working with, that we're reading together, I believe that it is a slow journey, but that the statements that Andy made following George Floyd's murder are that we are trying to walk in that direction as a church, and I'm not trying to fix it, or maybe I am, and I'm and I need to stop. But
I think what I get from you, Rachel, is that you're committed to going through the discomfort and keeping yourself or realigning yourself with some of the discomfort for greater good. I think that's what I get from you in the things that you've shared.
I'll make it personal too, and like I said, a lot of my engagement in this discussion or this movement or this effort is honestly curiosity. I have the privilege of being curious about somebody else's injustice. And you're right that at some point curiosity is not enough motivation. I'm no longer curious, and I can live without that experience. And I think I'm hearing, or I feel like it's coming to the surface a lot about education and learning never happens in comfort. And so the idea that if people can, between choosing comfort and growth, people generally choose comfort.
Right.
Until growth is easier than the discomfort of ignorance. And I think hopefully, as I've been curious and I've pulled the thread on some of these things, I have become uncomfortable in my ignorance to where growth is less uncomfortable. And so, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense.
I follow.
So I think to say, if we're anticipating that people will grow on the couch, you're right. It's very limited. And I think there are people who will never get off the couch.
Right.
I'm hopeful, though, that being on the couch becomes such a minority that it becomes marginalized. And that sounds really mean and ugly, but at some point, wrong gets marginalized. I have to believe in that. So I think that there is a point where will all hearts be redeemed? I wish, I hope. I want my heart to be redeemed. But I'm hopeful that there's a time when being, and I know ignorant is such a pejorative word, but being uninformed is more uncomfortable than being informed. I think we all have to make that happen. And then hopefully a lot of people get off the couch.
And there's 3 white people at this table and 2 black people, and I'm thinking that we're starting to get to the right ratio. When it comes to this work, white people to the front. We created this. We have to talk to people who look like us to get them off the couch.
I will say this, and I guess I'm saying this to our online participants or viewers. The progress that has been made in this country has never been made by Black people alone or people of color alone. And if we could have done it by ourselves, it would have been done. And so, for all the horrific things historically that have been have victimized people of color, there have always, by white people in this country, there have always been white people who have put their lives on the line to fight for what's right. And that has been a reality throughout history as well. And the truth is, we cannot do this. White people cannot do it alone, even though they created it. And Black people, because you guys don't know our experience. That was to Tammy's point. And Black people cannot do it alone, or else it would have been done already. And so it has to be done with us together. It's not going to be done by one group or the other.
I'm ecstatic that there are so many people that are marching that don't look like me, and they're bringing their children to those marches, and you're creating a whole generation of a younger generation that's standing up and saying this is not okay, and they're starting young.
And they're practicing something. They're not just watching it.
So I totally agree with you, and I also agree with not for me without me. So as we're doing this, let's make sure the right people are at the table, so that we're working together for that right solution, and not what you perceive to be the perfect outcome. But that being said, just to see that's what gives me hope. I'm cynical to some degree, because I think we're very much a microwave generation right now. So we had a White Coats Black Lives event at our hospital. I didn't go because I just said to a friend of mine cynically, let's see what happens in 2 months when everybody's back to work and things go back to normal. And we talk a good talk today about what we're going to do differently, but let's actually see what will happen. And
I think a lot of us feel that way.
Because we can't turn it off, right? So, but the other part of me is encouraged. In the short time that I've gotten to know you, Rachel, I'm encouraged that there are people that don't look like me that are as engaged and as involved. Brad and I have had some conversations as well, and I think the good thing that's come out of this is I've fostered relationships with people in a way that I haven't before. Tammy and I and Jeff have always been great friends for a long period of time, but I think just even our conversations now, it's a little bit different, and so I'm grateful for that, and I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for that. So.
I think we're running out of time.
I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
This has been very good, and not an end. And so I'm not going to try to tie it into a neat bow, because that's not possible, and nor should it be the goal. May we remain uncomfortable. And I've been asked to finish with just a couple of ways that we can move forward with action. And I'm going to leave it at a very simple place. Brad has referred to pulling on a thread. Find your thread. There is no perfect place to start, but starting is what is important. And so pick up, don't try to figure out the perfect book to read. Pick up a book. Don't try to figure out the perfect movie to watch. Watch the movie. And then that will lead you to, I believe, with the Holy Spirit's guidance, to the next thing and to the next thing. And let's have the uncomfortable conversations. The joy and the true friendship, rather than the superficial friendship that comes as a result of examining those shadows in our souls that we inherited, that we didn't put there, that we've breathed through the air, that as we try to examine that within ourselves, it's uncomfortable, it's incredibly painful, and it is so rewarding. And so I want to finish with a prayer that was written for the initiative called Be the Bridge, which is a Christian multiracial, bridging the racial divide group. And this prayer is written by Jen Wickstrom. Father, may we have the strength and courage to acknowledge the truth of our country's past. As we move forward, may we acknowledge that there are systems and laws in place that are not for all people. May we have the courage to stand up and seek out these truths. May we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. May we have the courage to ensure that those sitting at our table fully reflect your kingdom. Amen.